Now that Harold's gone, Grieve, pack your bags and never come back.
Mrs. Parker, several of these accounts are in your name only.
Business $96,000 with interest. Justice served.
The old Parker house sat hidden among the ancient oaks of Charleston's outskirts, where wind from the marsh slid through cracked windows, carrying the scent of salt and shadow. The house had stood for nearly a century, sturdy, dignified, and haunted in its own way. Warm lamplight spilled over the heavy oak dining table, glowing against polished silver and white china. 3 people sat around it, but only 2 seemed alive. Evelyn Parker, 71, sat at the head. Her back was straight, her hands folded in her lap. Across from her, an empty chair waited, Harold's chair. His presence still clung to it, faint but stubborn, the warmth of his laugh, the quiet authority in the way he had led family prayers, the smell of cedar and coffee that once lingered on his shirts. Tonight, that warmth was gone. Silence ruled the table, a silence so thick it seeped into the wood and wrapped around the chandelier's dim light. "Pass the potatoes," said Vanessa, her daughter-in-law, her voice sharp enough to nick glass. Evelyn startled slightly. Her hand shook as she lifted the serving spoon. "Of course, dear," she said, her tone soft, too soft, almost apologetic. But Vanessa didn't look at her. She set her phone down, screen glowing with a photo of Harold's funeral, his smile framed in grayscale, flowers fading around his portrait. "This dinner," Evelyn murmured, half to herself, "it feels strange without him." No answer. Only the rhythmic tapping of Greg's fingers against the table, slow, steady, like a heartbeat restrained. Her son, her only son, 43 years old, handsome in the tired, corporate way of men who'd stopped dreaming too soon. Evelyn tried to smile, to fill the space Harold had left behind. "You know," she began gently, "your father always hoped this house would stay in the family. Enough, Mother," Vanessa interrupted, her voice cool and even, as if correcting a student. Evelyn blinked. "Excuse me?" Vanessa laid her fork down and leaned forward, her lips curved, but there was no warmth behind them. "Now that Harold's gone," she said, "it's time for you to start making arrangements." The air cracked, invisible glass splintering between them. "Arrangements?" Evelyn repeated softly. "For what?" "Your things. The papers. Clothes." Vanessa's smile tightened. "You know what I mean. This house isn't really yours anymore." Evelyn's pulse fluttered. "What did you just say?" Greg cleared his throat, his eyes fixed on his plate. "Vanessa, I'm just being honest," she said smoothly. "The deed was in Harold's name. And now, naturally, his son is the rightful heir." Her gaze met Evelyn's, sharp as a blade. "In other words, you're living here as an uninvited guest." The grandfather clock struck 8. Each chime landed like a hammer against bone. Evelyn felt her heart skip, missing its rhythm. 32 years of life had been built within these walls, 32 years of laughter, loss, and love. Every inch of this house had her touch. The curtains she'd sewn, the floor she'd polished until her knees ached, the magnolia tree she'd planted with Harold when Greg was born. And now, with a single sentence, Vanessa had erased her from her own home. Evelyn let out a laugh, brittle, high, like glass under strain. "Vanessa, that's absurd. Harold and I bought this house together. We paid for it, lived in it." Vanessa tilted her head, tone syrup-sweet and venomous. "And he died here, too. Don't you think it's time for something new?" Greg looked up briefly, his jaw clenched. "Mom, we just want what's best for you. This house is too big, too isolated. You shouldn't live alone. There are places that can." Evelyn's voice sliced through his. "A retirement home? Is that what you're saying?" Greg's shoulders tensed. He didn't meet her eyes. Vanessa spoke again, her voice smooth as oil. "Please, don't make this harder than it has to be. You have 2 weeks, Evelyn. After that, we'll need to start renovations. 2 weeks. The words landed like a blow. 2 weeks to leave the house she'd built a life in. 2 weeks to pack away a marriage, a family, a lifetime. Evelyn rose slowly, trembling, but her back remained straight. And what does my son think of this? Greg's mouth opened, then closed. He stared down at the potatoes, cold and untouched. Vanessa answered for him, smiling faintly. Your son thinks you should do the right thing. In that moment, Evelyn saw Greg as she never had before. Not as the boy who had once clung to her hand when thunder scared him, or the teenager who cried after failing his first test, but as a man who had traded his conscience for comfort. Something inside her, something that had been sleeping for years, began to stir. She said nothing more. Evelyn turned and walked from the table. The scrape of her chair echoed through the silence, long and hollow. Behind her, Vanessa's whisper floated after her like a curse. She'll thank us later. On the staircase, Evelyn's steps sounded like the slow ticking of a clock winding down. The hallway seemed endless, the air colder with every step. In the bedroom, Harold's clock still ticked faithfully, the only steady sound left in her world. Evelyn walked to his desk. The faint scent of his cologne still lingered, cedarwood and sage, a ghost trapped in the wood grain. She opened the top drawer, old bills, letters, his worn reading glasses. Then she pulled the bottom drawer, and something slipped free. A pale yellow envelope landed softly on the floor. She bent down. On it, written in Harold's familiar hand, "If they ever turn against you, Evelyn, go to the bank." Her breath caught. For a moment, the room seemed to tilt. She sank to her knees, fingers trembling as she traced the letters of his name. No tears came. Only a deep, creeping chill, the sense that someone unseen had just touched her shoulder, whispering from the other side. "They think you're weak, my love. Prove them wrong." The hallway light flickered. Outside, the wind rose from the marsh, rattling the windows with fingers of rain. Evelyn stared down at the letter, not at the paper, but at what it meant. A hidden path, a secret plan. Harold had known this day might come. Her lips moved. Not a prayer, not a plea, a vow. "I will." The final image. The camera drifts backward through the rain-streaked window. Inside, the silver-haired woman sits alone beneath a single lamp, the small yellow envelope glowing in her hand. The house hums with wind and memory. And in that dim light, the quiet begins to shift, no longer grief, but resolve. The beginning of a counterstrike no one will see coming. That night, Charleston drowned beneath rain. It wasn't the kind of storm that screamed, it whispered. Long, steady sheets of water slid down rooftops, dripped from eaves, and pressed their cold fingers against every windowpane of the old Parker house. In the upstairs bedroom, Evelyn Parker sat motionless on the edge of her bed. Her fingers dug into the quilt until the veins showed beneath her pale skin. The fabric was soft, the same one Harold had bought her years ago on their anniversary, but tonight it felt coarse, foreign, like everything else that once belonged to them. The room around her was too still. It had once been the heart of her life, mornings of laughter, the aroma of coffee mingling with the salt air, the lazy shuffle of Harold's slippers as he teased her about forgetting her glasses again. Now all that remained was the slow, relentless ticking of the clock on the nightstand, tick, 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 counting down what little she still owned. On the bedside table, their wedding photograph leaned slightly askew. Evelyn reached to straighten it. As she did, a familiar scent drifted up, cedarwood and sage, Harold's cologne. The faint fragrance hit her like a hand pressed gently to her cheek. She closed her eyes, and for a moment, he was there again, that quiet smile, that gaze that always seemed to read her mind before she spoke. Then the illusion broke. The rain hissed against the window. The clock ticked on. Evelyn sighed and bent to open the drawer of the old walnut desk, looking for her notebook. Her hand brushed against something stiff, a latch, catching on hidden wood. Then came a soft click, as if the house itself had exhaled. A pale yellow envelope slipped out and landed by her feet. There was no seal, no address, only one short line scrawled in Harold's firm, familiar hand. "If they ever turn against you, Evelyn, go to the bank." Evelyn froze. The words blurred as she read them. For a heartbeat, the sound of rain faded, the clock stopped. Even her pulse seemed to vanish. Her lips parted. "Harold," she whispered into the room, her voice cracking. "Did you know this would happen?" The only answer was the sigh of the wind. It crept through the cracked window, lifting the curtain like a ghostly hand. The fabric swayed once, twice like a nod. Evelyn's breath trembled. She reached for the envelope and opened it carefully. Inside lay another sheet of paper, a printed statement from First National Bank of Charleston. Her name stood boldly across the top corner, Evelyn M. Parker. Her throat tightened. The realization hit her like the second strike of lightning. Harold had planned something deliberate. Under the soft gold light of the bedside lamp, memories washed through her like waves. She saw him again, sitting by that same window on a quiet Sunday afternoon, reading the Post and Courier. He'd looked up from the paper and asked, "Eve, do you believe what we've built will be protected?" She had laughed, stirring sugar into his coffee. Protected from what? Harold had smiled, that small, knowing smile of his, the one that always frightened her a little, because it seemed to see too far ahead. "I never bet on the kindness of people," he'd said. "Only on love and numbers." Back then, she thought it was another one of his cryptic jokes. Now, the meaning fell into place like pieces of a lock clicking open. He hadn't just left her memories, he'd left her instructions. Evelyn rose from the bed, the floor creaking beneath her bare feet. The room felt alive again, its silence charged with something new, not grief, but awakening. Her gaze swept over the space, their wedding portrait, his reading glasses still folded neatly on the nightstand, his slippers lined up by the bed as though he'd step into them any moment. Everything seemed to watch her now, to ask what she would do. The pain came next, sharp and clean. The betrayal still burned like fresh salt in an open wound. Her son's silence. Vanessa's calm cruelty. They hadn't just taken her home, they'd taken the story of her life and written her out of it. She gripped the letter, her nails leaving small half-moons in the paper. A single tear fell, landing on the word bank and bleeding the ink. Evelyn wiped it away, breathing hard. That one phrase, once a suggestion, had become an order. "Go to the bank." She crossed to the window and pushed it open wide. The cold air flooded in, whipping her silver hair around her face. The curtains flared, white against the dark, like a sail catching wind. And in that wind, she heard it faint but clear, a voice she had loved for half a century. "I told you I'd never leave you, Eve." Her breath caught. Every hair on her arms rose. She turned, scanning the room, but she was alone. Then, as if in reply, a small photograph on the desk toppled forward. She picked it up. Harold's smile looked different now, not just loving, but prophetic, as if he'd known this moment would come. Lightning split the sky. Thunder followed close behind, rolling over the marsh. For an instant, the mirror reflected her in a flash of white light, a silver-haired woman with tired eyes, yet something fierce burning beneath them. It wasn't despair anymore. It was curiosity, resolve. Evelyn sat back down at the desk and took a pen from the drawer. On the back of Harold's note, she wrote in careful script, "Tomorrow. I'll find out what you meant, Harold." The rain thudded against the glass, harder now, as though approving. She folded the paper neatly, tucked it back into the envelope, and slipped it into the pocket of her nightgown. Thunder rumbled again. The ceiling light flickered, casting long, slow shadows that stretched like reaching hands across the walls. Evelyn turned off the lamp. The room sank into a hush broken only by the distant cry of the wind. Moonlight streamed through the open window, soft and silver. It caught the edge of the paper on her desk, illuminating the words, "Go to the bank." The phrase shimmered faintly, a doorway waiting to be opened. She lay back on the bed, her eyes open, staring at the ceiling. The dinner replayed in her mind, Vanessa's voice, cold as a knife, Greg's silence. The phrase that had cut deeper than any wound, "The house was never really yours anyway." Those words echoed, twisted, hardened into something new: determination. She whispered into the darkness, "Tomorrow, they'll see who I really am." Outside, the storm began to ease. The final image. The camera drifts backward from the glowing window, rising into the clearing night. The rain slows to a mist. Moonlight spreads over the roof of the old Parker house. Inside, a woman lies awake, not grieving, but ready. And somewhere in the wind that rolls in from the sea, the first true storm of her life is gathering, quiet, cold, unstoppable. When life pushes you into its coldest, emptiest room, would you still have the courage to listen to the voice of the one who loved you even after they're gone? Comment A if you believe some loves never die. Comment B if you think it's time to stop looking back and save yourself. The morning after the storm, Charleston seemed reborn, washed clean, but hollow. The sky hung pale blue over streets that still shimmered with puddles, every reflection broken into ripples by the softest breeze. The smell of rain clung to the air, sharp and metallic, as if the city had been rinsed of its sins, but not its memories. Evelyn Parker stepped out of her old sedan, the engine sighing into silence. Her breath formed a faint mist in the cool air. Ahead of her rose a glass building, modern, symmetrical, gleaming against the morning sun. First National Bank of Charleston. The gold letters shone like polished armor. She stood there for a long moment, one gloved hand resting against the car door, her heart thudding with something she couldn't name. The glass doors reflected her image, a small woman in a pale blue coat, her silver hair pinned neatly, her shoulders squared out of habit more than strength. A widow. But behind the tired eyes was something else, a spark that had survived the storm. Inside, the bank was all marble and hush. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and wealth. Customers murmured in low voices, their shoes clicking like distant metronomes. A woman at the front desk greeted her with a polished smile. "Good morning, ma'am. How can we assist you today?" Evelyn hesitated. Her voice came out soft but steady. "I need to speak with your branch manager, Helen Carter." "My name is Evelyn Parker. I'm Harold Parker's wife." The woman's smile faltered for just an instant. Then recognition softened her tone. "Oh, Mrs. Parker. Of course." Mrs. Carter spoke highly of Mr. Harold. "Please, follow me." The corridor was lined with glass offices and framed certificates, symbols of trust and precision. Evelyn's heels clicked softly on the marble, echoing the rhythm of her heartbeat. Helen Carter stood when Evelyn entered. She was in her late 50s, elegant but grounded, her gray hair pulled into a low twist, her eyes bright with intelligence. "Mrs. Parker," she said warmly, extending a hand. "I was so sorry to hear of Harold's passing. He was a remarkable man, meticulous to a fault. We all admired him." Evelyn managed a faint smile. "Thank you, Helen. I came because he left a note. It said, 'If they ever turn against you, go to the bank.'" Her voice cracked slightly. "I don't know what he meant." Helen nodded gently. "Let's take a look together, shall we?" The quiet hum of the office filled the space, the low murmur of air vents, the rhythmic tapping of Helen's fingers across the keyboard. Each keystroke seemed to measure Evelyn's pulse, faster now, louder in her ears. In her mind, Harold's voice repeated itself, "If they ever turn against you, Evelyn, go to the bank." Helen stopped typing. Her eyes narrowed slightly at the screen. Surprise flickered across her face, then confusion. "Mrs. Parker," she said carefully, "this is interesting. There are more accounts under your name than I expected." Evelyn straightened. "More accounts? How many?" Helen printed several pages and slid them across the desk. The printer buzzed softly, the pages warm when Evelyn touched them. 5 bold headings stared back at her in black ink. Joint checking account, Harold and Evelyn Parker savings account, Harold and Evelyn Parker certificate of deposit, Evelyn M. Parker money market account, Evelyn M. Parker. The Parker Family Trust beneficiary, Evelyn M. Parker. For a moment, the words didn't make sense. They blurred, swam together, like a foreign language she was suddenly expected to understand. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "What does this mean?" Helen took off her glasses, folding them neatly on the desk. Her expression softened. "It means, Mrs. Parker, that some of these accounts are in your name alone. Mr. Parker opened them about 5 years ago and began transferring funds gradually, always legally, always documented. He must have done this quietly, very deliberately." The room seemed to contract around her. Evelyn's hand trembled as she gripped the edge of the desk. "In my name?" she repeated, as if hearing someone else's life. "Yes," Helen confirmed gently. "And the family trust as well. According to our records, you are its sole beneficiary." For a long moment, Evelyn didn't move. The air felt thin, charged with disbelief. Then, slowly, a warmth spread through her chest, not joy, not even relief, but recognition. Harold had known. Her husband practical, reserved, Harold had foreseen the storm. And for 5 patient years, he had built her a fortress out of signatures and numbers. She could see it all now, his quiet errands to the bank, the way he'd say, "Just paperwork, Eve. You stay home." Her mild scolding when he came back late. His smile faintly amused, faintly sad. He hadn't been hiding from her. He had been preparing her. "Could I see the statements?" she asked softly. Helen nodded and printed several more pages. The numbers on them gleamed like coded reassurance, not a fortune, but security enough to make the world stop tilting. Over $500,000, tucked safely within the Parker Family Trust. Helen looked up. "He wanted to protect you," she said simply. "He loved you very much." Evelyn laughed, a fragile, quivering sound that broke into tears. "No," she said, wiping her eyes. "He didn't just love me, he knew." Helen frowned lightly. "Knew what?" "That they'd turn their backs," Evelyn whispered. She gathered the papers carefully, aligning each page as if they might tear under her touch. They weren't just documents, they were proof that Harold had trusted her more than anyone else. When she rose to leave, Helen reached across the desk and took her hand. "Mrs. Parker," she said, "if you ever need help, please call me. Mr. Harold once told me, my wife will never be alone." Evelyn froze mid-step. "He said that? When?" "About 6 months before he passed," Helen replied. A long, delicate silence filled the room. Evelyn's throat ached with unshed words. Finally, she nodded. "Then he was right," she said softly. "I'm not alone." Outside, the morning sun had climbed higher. The world looked different, not softer, but clearer. The wind lifted her silver hair as she descended the stone steps. In her bag, the papers rustled faintly, promises, safeguards, the last message of a man who had seen too far ahead. She stopped at the bottom step, gazing up at the sky. It was bright, endless blue, reflected in the puddles at her feet. A single tear escaped, warm against her skin. But this time, she smiled. "You knew, didn't you, Harold?" she whispered. "And now, so do I." The camera pulls back. A small figure walks down Meeting Street beneath the resurrected sun. Her shadow stretches long and sure behind her. In her hand, she carries a folder full of proof, and in her chest, a heart that beats steadier than it has in months. Behind her, the bank's glass facade gleams like a light just turned on after a long night, the first quiet flicker of Evelyn Parker's rebirth. That afternoon, Charleston wore the color of old steel. The rain had stopped, but the world still smelled of it, wet asphalt, moss, and salt. The clouds hung low, pressing down on the city like a heavy thought that refused to pass. Evelyn Parker stood before the small brick building on King Street, brushing a few raindrops from her coat before stepping inside. A brass plaque on the door read, Carolyn Tate and Associates, Accounting and Trust Services. Inside, the office smelled faintly of lemon polish and paper, a scent that always reminded Evelyn of Harold's study. The hum of the air conditioner and the faint shuffle of files created an odd sense of calm. Carolyn Tate rose from behind her desk with a smile that was both kind and cautious. She was in her 60s, hair streaked with white, posture still sharp as ever. Behind her, framed certificates gleamed under the soft lamplight, along with an old black and white photograph of Harold and Carolyn taken decades earlier. Harold looked impossibly young in that photo, sleeves rolled up, dust on his shirt, his hand resting lightly on Carolyn's shoulder. The words Parker and Sons Construction, LLC, were painted across the signboard behind them. Evelyn's chest tightened. In that picture, Harold looked alive, steady, proud, certain. He was remarkable, Carolyn said gently, pouring tea into 2 cups. Meticulous to the point of madness. I used to tell him that no man should love balance sheets more than his wife. She smiled softly, the kind that carried genuine affection. I'm so sorry, Evelyn. Losing him was a loss for everyone. Evelyn's lips curved in a faint, uncertain smile. Thank you. But lately, I've been realizing there were things Harold never told me, things I should have known. Carolyn's brows knit slightly. You came about the company, then? Evelyn nodded. Yes. The bank mentioned accounts and a trust. I didn't understand. Greg said Harold sold the business after retiring. The mention of Greg's name brought a flicker to Carolyn's eyes, too brief for most to catch, but Evelyn did. She'd spent a lifetime reading silences. The company was never sold, Mrs. Parker, Carolyn said slowly. Her tone was calm, deliberate, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. She opened a drawer, pulled out a file, and slid a document across the table. 5 years ago, Harold restructured everything. He transferred ownership from himself to the Parker Family Trust, and the sole beneficiary of that trust, Carolyn paused, meeting Evelyn's eyes, is you. The room went still. Even the air conditioner seemed to hush. Evelyn blinked, as though the words were foreign. I'm the owner? On paper, yes, Carolyn replied. Harold wanted to safeguard what he called the family's true foundation. He didn't want the company's future determined by anyone's temper or anyone's spouse. Evelyn's hands trembled as she set her teacup down. On the wall behind Carolyn, the Parker and Sons logo carved into an old wooden plaque seemed to stare back at her like an accusation. A company named after her son, but belonging, in truth, to the mother he had cast aside. She took a shallow breath. Does Greg know? Carolyn hesitated, then shook her head. He believes he's in control. Harold allowed him to think so for peace, perhaps. But on record, Greg was never granted ownership. Harold retained authority through the trust. She reached into a cabinet and pulled out a thick bundle of files bound with a worn rubber band. The papers smelled faintly of ink and time. These will explain it better than I can. Evelyn loosened the band and flipped through the first few pages. Each form bore Harold's careful handwriting beside Greg's messy scrawl: temporary loan agreement, business advance, personal withdrawal. The totals stacked like bricks on a wall: $8,000, $17,000, $26,000, until they reached nearly $90,000. Stamped in red across every page, payment deferred, interest pending. Her hand flew to her mouth. My God, she whispered. He owes money to his own father's company? Not just the company, Carolyn said quietly. To you. Evelyn's head snapped up. Because, Carolyn continued, Parker and Sons now belongs to the Parker Trust. And the trust's sole beneficiary is you. Every cent Greg borrowed legally or otherwise is owed to that trust. Which means he's been taking from you, Mrs. Parker. A rush of heat spread up Evelyn's neck, into her face. It wasn't just pain, it was revelation hot, furious, and humiliating. Her son, her only son, had stood in her dining room, pretending concern while quietly bleeding her dry. He had looked her in the eye, told her it was time to move on, while pocketing her inheritance one withdrawal at a time. Carolyn folded her hands, her voice low and careful. Harold didn't keep this from you out of secrecy, he once told me. Evelyn will need to stand alone one day, and I won't be there to hold her hand. He knew Greg's weaknesses and Vanessa's ambition. The words sank deep. Evelyn could almost hear Harold saying them, that patient tone he used when trying to prepare her for things she didn't want to face. She remembered that last dinner, his silence, the way his eyes had lingered on her as if he wanted to say something but couldn't. Now she understood. He hadn't just left her wealth, he'd left her power. Evelyn sat up straighter, a subtle shift that felt monumental. Carolyn, she said, is the company still active? Very much so, Carolyn replied. Harold appointed Jack Morales as operations manager. You remember him? Evelyn nodded. The one who built the Street Augustine project. That's right, Carolyn said. Jack's been running day-to-day operations. The business is healthy, profits steady, contracts secure. All earnings still flow into the trust. Evelyn's voice lowered. Jack's loyal? Carolyn smiled. Loyal enough to call Harold boss even after he retired. If you asked, he'd show up in minutes. Evelyn considered that, then shook her head. Not yet. I need to think. To plan. She stood, adjusting her coat, her spine straight as a line of marble. No one, not Greg, not Vanessa, can know about this, Carolyn. Carolyn nodded solemnly. Of course. But what are you going to do? Evelyn paused at the door. The gray sky outside had deepened, and rainwater still clung to the glass like tears refusing to fall. When she spoke, her voice was low, calm, but it carried the chill of iron. I'll take everything back, she said. Not with anger. With truth. Driving home, the city lights flickered against the wet asphalt. The old bridge over the marsh loomed ahead, glistening gold in the setting sun. Evelyn crossed it slowly, her reflection wavering in the water below. For a fleeting moment, she saw herself as she once was, soft, uncertain. Then the light shifted, and the woman staring back from the windshield was someone sharper, steadier. She glanced at the folder on the passenger seat, the pages of numbers, signatures, and secrets. A small smile curved her lips, thin as a blade. They think I'm the prey, she murmured. But Harold was the one who set the trap. The camera lingers on her car as it disappears into the fading light, the storm above her breaking, but the one within her just beginning to rise. When you discover that your own blood has betrayed you, what would you do? Comment C if you'd fight for justice, no matter what it costs. Comment D if you'd let karma find them in its own time. Saturday morning arrived sharp and bright, the kind of day Charleston pretends is peaceful before it breaks your heart. The sky was clean as glass, washed pale by the tide of last night's rain. But the air was thick, almost metallic, as though the storm hadn't quite finished what it started. Inside the Parker home, sunlight spilled across the kitchen tiles, glinting off polished silver and the rim of a porcelain coffee cup. Evelyn Parker stood barefoot in her robe, measuring the silence more carefully than the coffee grounds she poured into the filter. Each movement, the clink of the spoon, the sigh of the kettle, was slow, deliberate, precise. She had always believed that control could be found in the small rituals of the morning. But today the air itself felt watchful. Then came the sound of tires crunching gravel. Evelyn froze mid-motion. Through the lace curtains, she saw a dark sedan pull up the drive, sleek, new, and unfamiliar. The door opened, and Greg stepped out, the hem of his tailored gray suit catching the light. Behind him, another door closed more quietly. A man in a dusty work shirt followed, his hands still rough from labor. Greg's voice cut through the morning stillness, sharp and commanding. "Mom, we need to talk." Evelyn didn't turn. She stirred her coffee once, twice, and replied in a voice that sounded far too calm for what was coming. "The door's open. Come in." Greg entered like he owned the place or wanted to. His posture was rigid, his jaw clenched tight with a kind of confidence that is built on desperation. The suit looked expensive but ill-fitting, like armor borrowed from someone else's war. Behind him, Jack Morales lingered by the door. His presence was a contrast in every sense, steady, grounded, still wearing his work boots dusted with cement. His eyes flicked between mother and son, sensing the current that ran between them. Evelyn looked past Greg and smiled faintly at Jack. "Jack, you're here early." Jack nodded, voice low but urgent. "I thought you should hear this from me, Mrs. Parker." His words were cautious, each one weighed like stone. Greg moved to the table, placing his leather briefcase down with a thud that seemed to claim the space. He clicked it open, pulled out a neat stack of papers, and spread them before him like a dealer, setting the rules of the game. "Mom," he began briskly, "I'm taking over company operations. From now on, Vanessa and I will handle all decisions. Tom in accounting will send you updated contracts to sign, just procedural stuff. Once you sign, it'll make things easier for everyone." Evelyn placed her coffee down with care, the small sound of porcelain against wood echoing in the room. Her voice, when it came, was soft, but there was weight in it, like the stillness before thunder. "Transition the company, Greg? From whom to whom?" Greg's frown deepened. "From Dad, of course. He's gone, Mom. Someone has to take responsibility. I'm the heir, that's how it works." Jack cleared his throat, shifting slightly. "Greg, maybe you should slow down. Your father gave me instructions before he passed to take orders only from the rightful owner." Greg's eyes flashed with irritation. "The rightful owner is me, Jack." "Don't make this emotional." Jack didn't move. "Mr. Harold said the same words every time we spoke, only from the owner." Then he turned to Evelyn and inclined his head. "Mrs. Parker, I think it's time you told him." The room froze. Even the clock on the wall seemed to hold its breath. Greg turned toward his mother, confusion creeping into his voice. "What's going on?" Evelyn walked to the table, a thin folder in her hand. She set it down in front of her son with a small, deliberate motion, a soft thud that hit harder than any shout. "This," she said evenly, "is a copy from your father's records. His real records." Greg scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "You think some old papers can change anything? Mom, this is our company. Ours." Evelyn didn't answer. She opened the folder, flipping it to the first page, and pointed to the top line printed in bold. "The Parker Trust Beneficiary, Evelyn M. Parker." Then she looked up and her eyes, for the first time, looked like Harold's. Cold, sure, unflinching. "The owner," she said, "is me." Greg froze. His breath caught, his body stiffening as if struck, the smirk that had hovered on his lips dissolved into nothing. For a long moment, the only sound in the kitchen was the tick of the wall clock. Each second landed like a hammer against the air. That's impossible," Greg whispered. "Dad told me he sold the company, that all he had left was the house." "No." Evelyn's voice cut through his sentence, clean and sharp as glass. "He didn't sell anything. He transferred every asset into the trust and made me the sole beneficiary." "Do you know why, Greg?" Greg's jaw tightened. His throat worked as he swallowed. "Why?" Evelyn's eyes didn't blink. "Because he knew this day would come. Because he knew one day you'd let that woman beside you turn you against your own blood." Greg's hand slammed against the table. "Don't talk about Vanessa like that." His voice shook not from courage, but fear. "You're twisting Dad's intentions. He trusted me." Evelyn smiled. "It wasn't cruel, it was worse than that. It was patient." "Yes," she said softly. He trusted you enough to keep proof of every dollar you took from the company. She turned another page, sliding it across the table. Total, $89,700. Plus interest. Greg's eyes darted to the document. His own signature stared back at him, repeated over and over beside Harold's neat handwriting. The blood drained from his face. He wasn't going to biff. Collect that, Greg stammered. Evelyn leaned forward, her tone almost tender. Maybe not. But now I own the company. And I can collect if I choose. Jack stood silently at her side, watching it unfold with the grim calm of a man witnessing justice, not cruelty. Greg's breathing quickened. Are you threatening me? Evelyn took a sip of her coffee. Her eyes didn't leave his. No, Greg. I'm reminding you who truly holds the power. Her voice was low, even, but there was something inside it that made him step back, as though the temperature in the room had dropped 10 degrees. She set the cup down gently, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the saucer. The motion was so careful it felt ceremonial. Your father believed in fairness, she continued. He believed in building something honest, something that would outlast both of us, and you turned it into a lifeline for your pride. Greg's shoulders slumped. The man who had entered the kitchen so sure of himself now looked younger, smaller, cornered. Evelyn didn't stop. Her voice softened, but it didn't waver. You have two choices now. Keep pretending you're in control, or accept that your father put his trust in the only person who ever earned it. For a heartbeat, Greg looked like he might cry or shout or apologize. But pride held him silent. Then, without another word, he gathered the scattered papers into a shaking hand, shoved them into his briefcase, and turned toward the door. The chairs scraped the floor harshly. The door slammed. The silence that followed was immense. Jack exhaled, shoulders easing. Mr. Harold would be proud, he said quietly. Evelyn didn't answer right away. She turned toward the window, where the light had shifted. The morning haze had lifted entirely, and sunlight now streamed in golden stripes across the counters, across her hands. No, she murmured, finally, a faint smile touching her lips. He'd be smiling, because the game has just begun. For a moment, she let herself stand in that sunlight. It was warm on her skin, not like comfort, but like strength. In that instant, the kitchen, the same one where she had once cooked Greg's childhood meals, where she had laughed and served and forgiven, no longer felt like a place of routine. It felt like a courtroom. The walls had witnessed betrayal. The table had borne confession, and the woman at its center was no longer the defendant. The camera lingers on Evelyn's face. Her eyes catch the sunlight, fierce and steady. There is no triumph there, only a deep, unshakable calm, the look of someone who has walked through fire and found herself still standing. For the first time in years, Evelyn Parker was not the one being controlled. She was the one holding the flag. And outside, beyond the open window, the marsh wind carried the scent of salt and cedar, the smell of something new beginning, born quietly from the ashes of what was lost. The Charleston County Courthouse stood like a monument carved from ice and truth. Its tall glass windows caught the morning sun, throwing fractured light across the marble floors. Every reflection shimmered like judgment waiting to fall. Evelyn Parker sat in the second row of the defense table, her posture straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She wore a gray suit, simple but dignified, the color of quiet strength. To her right sat Elliot Gray, calm, silver-haired, eyes sharp behind rimless glasses. To her left, Jack Morales, steady as a pillar, his calloused hands clasped tightly in restraint. Across the aisle sat Greg Parker and Vanessa. Greg's jaw was locked, his knuckles white against the table. He was dressed as if success could still save him, tailored suit, polished shoes, but his eyes betrayed the boy beneath the armor. Vanessa sat rigid beside him, fingers twisting her wedding ring, the skin around her eyes bruised from sleepless nights. They were here for what they called justice, but the irony was thick enough to choke on. The judge entered, a woman with iron gray hair and a gaze that left no room for theater. The gavel struck once, a single, resonant note. Case number 2416, she said. Parker versus the Parker Trust. The sound reverberated through the courtroom, the first gunshot of a war fought with documents instead of bullets. Greg's attorney rose first, young, confident, his suit crisp, his tone rehearsed. Your Honor, he began, his voice sliding smoothly through the air, my clients, Mr. and Mrs. Parker, are contesting the legitimacy of the Parker Trust. We believe Mrs. Evelyn Parker was manipulated, perhaps even coerced by her late husband, Harold Parker. This undue influence resulted in the unjust exclusion of their son from his rightful inheritance. He paused for effect, glancing toward the gallery as if expecting applause. We intend to prove that Mrs. Parker was not fully aware of the legal implications of her husband's actions. Greg's lips curved faintly. His lawyer was performing exactly as rehearsed. He even risked a glance toward his mother, a look that said, "You'll lose with dignity, at least." Elliot Gray did not look impressed. He stood slowly, as though even gravity obeyed him. Permission to respond, Your Honor? The judge nodded. Your Honor, Elliot began. The defense will present irrefutable documentation proving that the Parker Trust was created, executed, and maintained in full accordance with South Carolina trust law. He spoke without rush, his tone even, almost conversational. No coercion, no deception. Only preparation and foresight. He reached into his leather briefcase and removed a file thick enough to crush any pretense of ignorance. One by one, he laid the papers on the table in front of him. Here, he said, are 5 notarized documents bearing both Harold and Evelyn Parker's signatures, each witnessed and certified by bank officials at First National Bank of Charleston. The rustle of papers filled the silence like the draw of affections and undered bank officials. Sword. And, he continued, we have verified records of systematic deposits made by Mr. Harold Parker into accounts solely under Mrs. Parker's name over 5 years, consistent and traceable. Greg straightened, his confidence flickering. Vanessa's eyes widened, her hand gripped his arm. Elliot's voice sharpened slightly. Furthermore, Parker & Sons Construction LLC was officially transferred under the ownership of the Parker Trust in 2019. Which means, he paused, letting the moment hang in the air. Every asset, every contract, every cent associated with that company is and always has been the legal property of Mrs. Evelyn Parker. Greg's composure cracked. He shot to his feet, voice trembling with fury. That's a lie. My father would never. The gavel struck twice, hard. Mr. Parker, the judge said firmly, you'll have your turn. Sit down. Greg sank back into his chair, face flushed, his lawyer whispering frantically beside him. Evelyn remained perfectly still. Her eyes did not waver, her fingers did not twitch. She simply watched the same way Harold used to watch when the storm began, patient and knowing it would soon pass. Elliot continued, unbothered. And lastly, Your Honor, we present the signed loan agreements between Parker & Sons Construction and one Gregory Parker. The courtroom erupted in a soft murmur. Even the reporters in the back leaned forward. Elliot glanced up, his tone cooling to steel. The total outstanding debt, including interest and deferred payments, amounts to $96,214.72. He let the numbers sink in, his eyes finding Greg's. As of today, that debt is owed to Mrs. Evelyn Parker, the sole owner and trustee of the Parker Trust. Vanessa's breath hitched audibly. Greg froze, eyes darting to the papers on the evidence table, papers bearing his own signature in his own messy scrawl. Elliot turned slightly toward him, his voice measured but cutting. So technically, Mr. Parker, you've been borrowing money from your mother while attempting to sue her for the assets she already owns. The silence that followed was absolute. The judge peered down over her glasses. "Mr. Parker," she said, "do you contest these signatures?" Greg opened his mouth, but no words came. Vanessa's trembling hand found his, but even her touch couldn't disguise his silence. The truth was carved too clearly in ink for denial. Elliot adjusted his glasses, leaned toward Evelyn, and murmured, "Now, ma'am, you're lying." Evelyn stood. She didn't clear her throat. She didn't raise her voice. She simply looked at her son, the boy who once brought her seashells from the garden pond, the man who now sat pale under the weight of his own choices. "And by the way, Greg," she said softly, "you owe the company $96,000. She paused. Her gaze didn't flinch. With interest. The words landed like a gavel strike. For a moment, even the air seemed to forget how to move. Vanessa's quiet sob broke the silence, her face buried in her hands. Greg just stared, his mouth open but useless, the expression of someone who had finally seen the bottom of the hole he'd been digging. When the session adjourned, no one clapped. No one spoke. Even the bailiff hesitated before calling the next case. 3 weeks later, the verdict arrived. The court upheld the full legality of the Parker Trust, naming Evelyn Parker as its sole and rightful owner. Greg Parker was ordered to repay his $96,214 debt to Parker and Sons Construction, now under his mother's management, within 8 years through automatic deductions from his salary. Failure to comply would result in a lien against his property and retirement accounts. On Judgment Day, Vanessa wept quietly into her husband's shoulder. Greg's face was gray with exhaustion, stripped of arrogance. Evelyn watched them both. There was no gloating in her gaze, no triumph, only an old sadness that had finally burned itself into peace. As she stepped out into the Charleston sunlight, the courthouse doors swinging shut behind her, a reporter's voice cut through the noise. "Mrs. Parker, do you feel vindicated?" She paused, adjusting her scarf, her eyes reflecting the gold of late morning. "Justice served," she said softly. Then, almost to herself, "Harold always said the truth doesn't shout. It waits." And with that, she walked down the marble steps, back straight, step steady. Behind her, Greg sat on the courthouse steps, head bowed, watching his mother's small figure disappear into the brightness, a figure too small to be feared, too strong to be defeated. The camera tilts upward. The Charleston sky burns gold above her silver hair, waves of light, rolling like applause she'll never seek. And somewhere, in that warmth, Harold's voice drifts through the wind, quiet, certain, proud. "You did it, Eve. When the truth finally stands beside you, what would you choose?" Comment E if you'd forgive and move forward. Comment F if you'd let justice make them feel every ounce of the price of betrayal. 6 months after the Charleston trial, the sun rose slowly over the cliffs of Mendocino Coast, California, bathing the pine trees in a soft gold light. Below, the ocean pulsed steadily against the rocks, deep, rhythmic, warm, the heartbeat of the new world Evelyn Parker now called home. She sat on her wooden porch, linen robe fluttering in the morning wind. On the table beside her, a steaming cup of tea and a worn notebook labeled Parker and Sons Construction, now under the capable leadership of Jack Morales. Every Friday morning, Jack called with updates. Project progress, profit margins, client meetings, and he always ended the same way. "We're doing good, Mrs. Parker." Harold would be proud. Evelyn would smile softly, her voice calm but warm. He'd be prouder knowing we're still building something honest. The seaside cottage was small, but it held everything Harold had once dreamed of: a porch facing the Pacific, a stone fireplace, a tiny kitchen that always smelled of cedar, and a bookshelf filled with both of their favorites. She'd found it by accident, or perhaps by fate, just weeks after leaving Charleston. Among the Parker Trust records, tucked between balance sheets and contracts, Carolyn Tate had discovered a handwritten note from Harold, For Evelyn when she's ready for ocean air and no schedule but her own. Beneath the message lay a copy of a property deed, a cottage on the Mendocino Cliffs, purchased 3 years prior. Harold had bought it quietly, never mentioning it, saving it for the day she would need peace more than anything else. When Evelyn read it, she laughed and cried at the same time. He had known. He had always known. She would need a place not to hide, but to begin again on her own terms. Life in Mendocino was nothing like Charleston. No traffic, no whispers, no eyes watching her every move. Only seagulls calling above the cliffs and the salt-rich wind curling through the section. Open windows. Evelyn learned to start her mornings with small rituals. Brew the tea, water the plants, fold the linens just so. No one ordering her, no one rushing her, alone but no longer lonely. By midday, she walked along the silver-white sands where the tide carved gentle lines. The locals had grown fond of the silver-haired Lady Evelyn who always smiled when they passed. None of them knew she was the woman who'd won the trial that shook Charleston. None knew she'd once been thrown out of her own home by her only son, and she didn't need them to. Because true victory wasn't about making others bow, it was about living without the shadow of bitterness. In the late afternoons, Evelyn sat by the window desk, reading company emails. Jack's weekly reports came neatly typed. Street Helena Church project completed ahead of schedule. 2 new city contracts approved. Quarterly profits up 12%. She read them all, smiled faintly, and replied with the same message every time. Keep building. With honesty and heart. Her hands no longer trembled. Every keystroke now felt like a heartbeat, steady, alive, purposeful. Evelyn Parker, once a widow cast out of her home, now quietly led a construction company from a small cottage overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Harold was gone, but his legacy endured in every beam, every ledger, every act of integrity she upheld. He had built the foundation, she was raising the walls of their redemption. One evening, the wind from the ocean grew strong, scattering the papers on her table. Evelyn rushed to catch them, then stopped. The horizon was burning with light, the sun melting into the red-gold sea. She stood still, eyes glistening. "We made it, Harold." Her voice blended into the wind and was carried out to sea. Maybe, somewhere beyond the waves, he heard her. She walked back inside, gathered the papers neatly into her folder. On the wall, Harold's portrait hung, between 2 windows. The sunset glowed against his smiling face, warm, proud, gentle. Evelyn sat down, poured herself another cup of tea, and smiled. For the first time in many years, she no longer feared the night. Because this time, she had lost nothing, she had reclaimed herself. The sun was sinking slowly over the Mendocino coast. Golden light poured through the windows of the little wooden cottage, turning every wall the color of honey. The ocean breeze carried the scent of salt and the cries of gulls through the open window. At the table, Evelyn Parker sat reading an old ivory-colored envelope. The handwriting on it was painfully familiar, Greg's. She drew a deep breath and opened it. "Mom, I know you probably won't forgive me, but I need to say this. I finally understand what Dad did. It took losing everything to see how blind I've been. Vanessa and I are trying to fix things, therapy, work, paying the debt. We're settling what we owe to the business and to you. I'm sorry for everything. I hope one day you'll want to talk again. Love, Greg." Evelyn folded the letter, her fingertips brushing over the word love. There were no tears, only a long, tired sigh that ended softly, like release. She picked up a pen and wrote on a small piece of paper, her handwriting steady and neat, "Then pay your debt and your lessons slowly." It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't rejection. It was the kind of answer only someone who had been broken and learned to rise again could give. That evening, Evelyn put on her coat and drove along the coastal road to the town's community center. Outside the building, a sign read, "Women and Finance, Finding Your Power Again," hosted by Megan Tate. Megan Tate, daughter of Carolyn Tate, smiled warmly when she saw Evelyn walk in. "You came. I still can't believe you agreed to speak today." Evelyn laughed softly. "I don't think I have a story worth telling." Megan shook her head. "You have the story, one of survival. And that's what most of these women need to hear." The room was small, 20 women of different ages. Some divorced, some recently widowed, some stripped of their savings by their own children. Evelyn looked around, and in their eyes, she recognized something she knew too well: the fear of being left behind, the pain of being made invisible, the quiet terror of forgetting that they were once strong. When her turn came, she stood. Her voice did not tremble. 3 years ago, I thought I understood my family, my love, and my future. I was wrong about all three." The room went silent. The golden light of sunset slanted across her face. "But there was one person who believed I would have to stand again, a husband who knew that to protect someone isn't just to love them, it's to give them the strength to live without you." She told her story simply, without drama or pity, the dinner that changed everything. Harold's letter, the bank, the company, the day justice finally came. No tears, only deep, collective breaths from women who listened with their whole hearts. Then Evelyn said, "When people try to erase you from their story, you have two choices: disappear or write it again." Applause filled the room. Megan wiped her eyes. A young woman in the back stood up, voice trembling. "Mrs. Parker, I think I'm going to write mine too." Evelyn smiled. "Good. Make sure it's one worth remembering." By the time the session ended, night had fallen. Evelyn drove home under a sky full of stars. On the passenger seat lay Greg's letter, quiet, waiting, not yet finished. She didn't throw it away. She placed it carefully in a drawer, beside Harold's photograph. "You see that?" she whispered. "He's learning slowly, but he's learning." That night, the sea wind grew stronger. Evelyn poured herself a glass of red wine and stepped out onto the porch. The ocean stretched dark and endless before her, the moon scattered silver across the waves. She lifted her glass, her voice low but firm. "He loved me enough to make sure I'd never have to beg for a place at my own table again." She took a sip, closed her eyes, and let the wind comb through her silver hair. The rhythm of the waves merged with the rhythm of her heart, the sound of peace reclaimed. Far out on the horizon, the lighthouse beams swept across the sea, briefly lighting the little house on the cliff. The camera slowly pulled back, showing a woman alone but not lonely, strong, free, and whole, sitting beneath the moonlight, surrounded by ocean and serenity. When life offers you a chance to begin again, do you have the courage to open your heart one more time? Comment G if you still believe in a second beginning. Comment H if you'd rather keep your peace and never look back.